Mm-hmm.
Okay. Jim Willis, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Justin. Good to be with you.
Hey, we're glad to have you. So you have written a book, Near-Death Experiences, Afterlife Journeys and
Yeah.
Revelations. What's your background? How did you end up writing this book?
I was ordained as a minister back in 1972, maybe. I think something like that. And when I got out of seminary, I did a lot of other things. I was also a college professor, and I taught world religions, comparative religion, cross cultural studies, and even instrumental music. So I was doing a lot of different things. I was a part-time carpenter and long distance bicycle rider. I've ridden across the country a couple of times and all this kind of thing. But when I got out of seminary back in early 70s, um, I kind of expected that this, my lot in life would be to join this religious community, the spiritual community at church. And together we were going to tackle the big issues of life. What's life all about? Where do we come from? And everything else. I was in my early 20s at the time. And like all of us in our 20s, I had all the answers. I knew everything, And, and I had an experience early in about 1973, maybe. Um, and remember, this was before Raymond Moody wrote his book, Life After Life. That didn't come out until 1975. And Bruce Grayson hadn't done his, wasn't known for his work yet. So it was a different age. Um, we didn't even have a term for near death experience. Moody gave us that in 1975. Until then, we didn't even have a term for it. But early on, I was given a call and asked to come visit a woman in my congregation who was in the hospital, and I was told this is probably going to be her last stop. She was probably on her way out. She was in her 80s at this time. Wonderful, wonderful woman. In the book, I call her Hannah. And Hannah was a member of the church and everybody's favorite mother kind of thing. And when I went to see her in the hospital, I used to get into the habit of taking my guitar with me because she loved the old hymns of the church, and I'd sing "In the Garden" and "The Old Rugged Cross" and all that. And sometimes the other nurses would wheel patients in. We'd have a little chorus going and everything else, and it was a lot of fun. So we would sing, and I'd play the guitar. But on this particular occasion, it was the last time I saw her alive, as a matter of fact. I was putting away my guitar and I was alone with her in the hospital room. And she said something interesting to me. She said, "Who'd you bring with you this time?" And I said, "What? I'm alone, Hannah." And then she looked at me like she knew something that I didn't. And she said, "Oh, sometimes they wait till you've gone." She says, "I think the music attracts them." And music attracts them. And why would they wait until after I go? It never occurred to me back then. Music is vibration, and vibration has all kinds of uses and attracts forces and things that we just never understood. And she said, sometimes they wait until you're gone and then they come in through the portal. She said, portal. Well, I was standing at the foot of the bed and I looked out and I saw the doorway and no one was in the hallway. And if she had been in Europe, I can understand the use of the word portal because sometimes Europeans say that instead of door. But this was Massachusetts, for heaven's sake. We didn't use that word. So she said, "Yeah, they come through the portal." And I said, "Okay." I didn't want to upset an old lady, on her last, you know, days on earth. So I said, "Oh, that's great, Hannah. Real good." I put my guitar away. And I said, "Well, I'll see you next time." And I walked out. But on my way out of the hospital, I stopped by the nurse's station. And I said to the head nurse, "What was Hannah talking about? People coming with me and coming through the portal." Well, back in the early 70s, hospitals didn't have the same attitude toward this kind of thing that they do now. They're much more open now, I think. And she said, "Oh, Hannah's been talking that way lately, couple of days now. I think she's probably near the end." And it turns out she was last time I saw her. And so when I got the call the next day that Hannah had passed away that night, and could I, lead her funeral service, I said, "Oh, of course." So I took the guitar down and I sang "In the Garden," one of Hannah's favorite songs, and everything else. And well, I couldn't shake it. It had rung a bell, and I didn't know why. Her use of the word portal and her idea of they come after you've left. I just couldn't shake it, and that stayed with me as I grew in my own faith, my own understanding, and my Christianity had long since morphed into a totally different kind of Christianity. I still call myself a Christian, but a lot of Christians probably figure I'm not. I get a lot of letters saying, "Have you forgotten your first love?" and all that kind of stuff. But at any rate, 50 years went by. 50 years, and during that time, I had a chance to be with a lot of people who were very sick and who had visions, and some who had some very close to death, and some who had actually died. And I was with probably half a dozen people over those 50 years when I was. They flatlined, and I was pushed out of the room, and the nurses and the doctors came in, and once in a while they brought these people back, and they came back with unbelievable stories. And I'm kicking myself because, to be honest, I was a typical intellectual of my age, the 70s, and I was dealing with all this thing through a left brain intellectual thing. And when the body shuts down, the electricity ceases to fire right, and the neurons aren't firing right in the body, and it does weird things. And I bought the whole business about consciousness arising or emerging from the mind rather than the other way around. But 50 years later, I had retired and come out here to the woods because of South Carolina, because I never, I never achieved what I wanted to from ministry. I wanted a close relationship with the other, with spirituality, and I never really had that. There were moments, during church and prayer and singing and music, especially, did it to me, but I never achieved that thing. And so when I retired, I came out here with an agenda, and I was going to wrestle with God. I was going to say, "I will not let you go until you bless me," that kind of thing, from the Old Testament story. And lo and behold, my prayer was answered. It didn't come through traditional Christianity. It came through quite a different stage, much closer to what some people would call shamanism. And but at any rate, during those 50 years, I had changed, and I had a whole new output. And especially, I came out here to live in the woods on a retreat for 1 year. I built my house and came out here. Okay, God, 24 hours a day, you and me. You like a challenge? Here I am. And lo and behold, that constant meditation for a year and being away from people. I mean, there's weeks that go by I don't see anybody now, except for I built a house next door for my daughter, who was wonderful enough to give up a whole lot of her life to come up here and help me do what I do, and that kind of thing. But at any rate, 50 years later, some parishioners of mine from the church that I served just before I retired came up, and the husband said to me, "Jim, uh, did you hear my mother died?" And I said, "Yeah, Eva was a wonderful person, and she reminded me of Hannah in a lot of ways. She was a dear old lady who loved the old hymns of the church and everything else." And he said to me, "Jim, something strange happened in the hospital room." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "The last day I was there, I was with her all by myself. And she said, 'Who did you bring with you?'" I said, "Whoa." All of a sudden, from 50 years ago, Hannah's voice echoed in my brain. I'd carried it with me. "Who did you bring with you?" And he said to her, just like I said to Hannah, "No, Mom, I'm here all alone." And she said, "Oh, sometimes they wait till you leave to come in through the portal." And she used the word portal again. And those two incidents happening 50 years apart, put together with all of the experiences I've had with people who have died and come back with stories, um, always variations of the same themes, the themes that Raymond Moody pointed out so well. The tunnel, uh, exiting out of your body, looking down from on high, so to speak, and seeing the body, and going through the tunnel and seeing the light, and meeting loved ones, or meeting the being of light on the other end, and all that kind of thing. And I realized, much to my chagrin, that I had put off a lot of these things because I don't want to say I wasn't a believer. I was more of a hoper than a believer. I was hoping these things were true, but I really didn't have it deep. And I wondered how many opportunities I lost because I never could really follow through, because I was a product of that intellectual, scientific, academic education that I had. And I was slow moving away from that, especially in these last 16 years of being about here by myself in the woods, meditating literally all day. But I did manage to do it. It was later in life, and I wondered how much I missed out. And sometimes I regret it. Sometimes I think, well, it had to be that way, because I could have learned so much. But I began to be convinced that, well, something has to happen. I have to write about this. And so when a very good friend of mine, who was also a former parishioner, had an out of body experience himself, not an out of body, a near death experience himself. And by now I had never had a near death experience, but I had a lot of out of body experiences. And so I was, I think, seeing the same landscape. And when he told me his experience, his near death experience, and he described it so vividly, and I said, "This is what I'm going to build the book around, this out of body experience." And he gave me permission to use it. And his near death experience shows up in the last couple of chapters of this book. That's where the book came from, and apparently it's touched a nerve. A lot of people have talked about it.
Do you mind if I ask what denomination did you minister?
I still am a minister in the United Church of Christ, but I was all over the
Okay.
thing. I started out as a Congregationalist, a New England Congregationalist, in the same spiritual DNA as Cotton Mather and all that. And but even though the denomination, which of course merged with the United Church of Christ back in the 60s, even though that has a reputation of being a fairly liberal denomination, I was very conservative. I've gone all the way across the map. I was a fundamentalist. I was an evangelical. I was a charismatic. I was a flaming liberal, and all this kind of thing. So I've been all the way across the map. Right now, I just don't really, I suppose, fit in with anybody. But um, Christianity is still my home, and besides that, I love the music.
Well, so you mentioned some out of body experiences.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, is there any part of that you want to talk about or share from the book?
Well, sure. I Near Death Experiences. The book is really it's almost a sequel to a book I wrote earlier and published with a different publisher. This was with Inner Traditions, and it was called the Quantum Akashic Field. And it's kind of an out of body. It's kind of a how to book, a guidebook, so to speak, for astral traveling. And it came to me totally by accident. Matter of fact, for most of my life, I probably didn't even believe in this stuff. But when I had my first out of body experience, after having been up here in the silence of the woods for about 3 years and doing a lot of meditating, and found myself in my first out of body experience, I was like a fish out of water. I didn't know how to handle it. And after I had two or three more and became a little more accustomed to it, I spent a week up at the Monroe Institute studying out of body experiences with William Buhlman, who I think probably is one of the foremost teachers of out of body experiences in the world today. And it was a great week. I really enjoyed it. I probably didn't get as much out of it as I should have, because I'm kind of a loner. I'm not a group guy, and I don't enter into big groups very well, but this was a good group, and Bill was a wonderful teacher, and he gave us a lot of techniques which I have since refined to fit my own occasion and my own special ideas. But I find myself at first it was kind of difficult for me to talk about it because I was of that generation and that age and that particular cultural group who heard out of body experiences and rolled my eyes and went, oh yeah, sure, right, yeah, woo woo stuff, weird. But then it happened. And what are you going to do? All of a sudden, you have to say, am I going to believe this? Am I going to follow this or not? It was similar, I think, to what Raymond Moody went through and Eben Alexander went through. Um, they were not, really big into all this kind of stuff until it happened to them. And when they began to study it and look at it, all of a sudden they couldn't deny it anymore. And this whole idea of, I always been fascinated by the practical applications of physics, especially quantum reality. I haven't had enough math to enter into it and really speak the language. And so I'm one of those guys that quantum physicists hate because, I talk about it without being able to back it up with the math and all that kind of thing. But it just makes sense, especially since I've done so much work in ancient religions. And I read quantum reality now, and I look at their practical applications, and it sounds so much like what the Hindu rishis were talking about 6,000 years ago. And it seems as though the spiritual applications of this thing and the people who tried to find this kind of landscape and this kind of reality, parallel dimensions and all this kind of stuff that Hugh Everett talked about, for instance, way back in 1957, and got himself blackballed because he gave us the many worlds theory, and it effectively ended his career in physics. He died a broken man, really thinking he was a failure. And now his ideas, some people are considering him another Einstein because he was that far ahead. I wish they could have been better to him back in 1957. We might be a lot farther ahead. But at any rate, it's the same kind of thing. What the ancients found through intuition and through meditation and through their own right brain thinking is very similar to what the quantum physicists are discovering now through mathematics. It's two different languages, the language of mathematics and the language of intuition, but they're saying the same things. And these parallel dimensions that now physicists are accepting, these parallel dimensions are right there, and they're packed and filled with real life entities that are not just some kind of woo woo, um, imaginary friends kind of thing. But they're far advanced than what we can. There is a science behind it. We just don't understand the science yet, and I'm not sure we can understand the science as long as we stick to the materialistic paradigm we've had. But I think these things have been with us as long as we've been around. You go back to the ancient painted caves of Europe from 40,000 years ago and go into Lascaux and go into Pakmal and all those places. And what do you find? You find evidence of a shamanic spirituality where these shamans actually experienced something outside of themselves, a consciousness that was able to help them move out of their brains into the universal field of consciousness, which I think it really is the ground of our being. And there they had visions of things, and they went for a purpose. They didn't go just to get a thrill. They went for a purpose. They were healers, and they were trying to find information that would help them heal the people that their patients. And they came back with these magnificent landscapes in their head that language can't explain, not even today, not even today's language, let alone whatever theirs was. And so, how did they get these things out? They obviously didn't want to, they just didn't want to publicize them for the sake of publicity because they did something fantastic. They crawled underground, dangerous, dark, dank places. Can't think of any more words that begin with D. So, but they got back into these caves, half a mile underground, with what? A torch or something like that. And they drew on the walls what uh, uh, what they had experienced, what they saw. And now, if you want to go back even farther than that, you can go way back to the time of Neanderthal and Denisovan. You can go back 300,000 years even, and you can find burials with what? Grave goods, stuff that people would need, because even back then, 200,000, 300,000 years ago, the people who buried their loved ones must have felt that those loved ones were going into another life, because they put things in the grave with them that they thought they might need. And they put tools and weapons and stuff like that. And however else you want to interpret that, they must have believed that there was a reason that the people needed these kinds of grave goods with them. And so they buried them with them. To me, that just says it could be that the discovery of the other side, that could be of the discovery of life after death, that might have been the discovery that made us human. That's how far back it goes.
So you definitely feel like it predates the 1700s, like
Oh
some of
yeah,
the
yeah,
modern
yeah.
data that we
Oh
have.
yeah, way back.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm wondering about, for you personally, in terms of your spiritual practices, and you go out to the woods to meditate, and
Hmm.
as you said, to wrestle with God. Um, did that involve like centering prayer as a start? Where did you begin?
Yeah, yeah. I started off using the techniques that I have used all through Christianity: the idea of centering prayer, the idea of looking within, um, and looking within. I began to sense that life is more than just my body, that there was something else. And so it went into a long, involved study of the idea of consciousness. When I first came out here, I wasn't sure that maybe consciousness did just emerge from the brain itself. But then I began to understand, no, no, that is it. I wasn't happy with that. It didn't work. It didn't fit. And I found myself in a strange experience of centering prayer during meditation. And one time, especially, I remember I was trying to find the center of my being. And instead of being at the heart or in the chest or something like that, I found the center of my being. I couldn't picture it any other way except in front of me, outside of me, about 2 feet in front of me, and maybe off to the left just a little bit. And I said, how could the center of my being be outside of my body? And I think even in those early meditations, I think what I was discovering was that this this body is not. It's a vehicle. I like to use the term of well. Let me back up a little farther. Somewhere along the line here, I discovered dowsing, not just dowsing for water, but dowsing for earth energy. And in the process of dowsing every day, 2 or 3 times a day, discovering earth energy, and I discovered all kinds of fantastic things. Like I accidentally, without knowing it, when I bought this property, I moved right on top of an old quarry where the ancients used to quarry their stone tools, and we've found not only all kinds of lithic debitage, but we've found our tools and weapons and spear points and that kind of thing, everything else. And just below us, in the Savannah River, about 40 miles south, lies the Topper site, which has pushed one of the many sites around the world, around the country in North America, that has pushed the human population of North America way back. They found at the Topper site unequivocal um, evidence of people being here 50,000 years ago, and a whole lot more than the Clovis first idea, which was centered in archaeology for my whole lifetime. 16,000 years ago. No, no, they go back at least 50,000 years, which meant 50,000 years ago, people were right on the same property that I was, because I'm right upstream. from them. If they were down at the Topper side, they were certainly here, because they would have followed the stream banks and come right here, found the quarry, found the stones that they needed, and probably came back here all the time. And in dowsing for this kind of energy, of this ancient energy, I came across the whole idea that not only were there entities on the other side of a well, I call it a perception fence. We experience the world through our five senses. And on the other side of that perception fence, which is very valuable, I mean, it filters out a lot of information that would probably just leave us comatose if it all came through. But on the other side is a consciousness, which I believe is universal. And put that together with Hugh Everett's many worlds ideas, um, and you get the idea that there is a consciousness that is supervising, so to speak, many different realities, many different dimensions, many different realities. And I found I could communicate with it, at least through yes or no questions, through my dowsing rods. So when I had this experience of the center of my being outside of myself, I think that was probably the beginnings of my whole out-of-body experience. And I began to try to douse this, to try to just douse my own body, to find out, what is my body feeling? Is my body aware of forces and energies which I'm not aware of because it can't get through the filters of my brain? I like to describe it as, for those old enough listening to this, who are old enough to remember the old black and white little radio televisions with the antenna, the rabbit ear antennas on the top, and you could know that the antenna was picking up these TV waves. But when you picked up the antenna and moved it, you realized that these TV waves were going right through the room, right through our own bodies all the time. And we just didn't know it. Our bodies registered it, but our brains didn't. And so you can move the antenna and change the picture on the television screen. And it was kind of like dowsing rods, electronic dowsing rods, so to speak. And I began to finally come to the conclusion that our brains are much more of a receptor than a generator. We don't generate consciousness. I think we receive consciousness from outside. We perceive it through our brains, and then our brains interpret that in a logical, left brain, language oriented understanding. But I think it's much bigger than that. And that's why I can call consciousness now the ground of our being. I'll never forget one professor who I had trouble with in seminary way back in the 70s. And yet he said at that point, he said, whatever else God is mind. And I thought, mind. Well, I think what he was saying is God is consciousness. Consciousness is the force or the experience or the reality through which God looks at God's self. And I think that's the source that we come from. So in effect, we can say that God consciousness is within each one of us. I'm not really happy using the word God now, because I know what I mean by it, and I'm perfectly happy with that. But I know a lot of other people have quite a different idea of what God is. When I say the word God, I'm afraid they might think I'm talking about what they happen to believe. And if they happen to believe something different than me, then they won't understand me. So I'm trying to experiment with other words. And the word that I'm using now, besides consciousness, is source, the place from which we come, the place to which we return. And I think that's what people are seeing in a near-death experience. They are getting ready to return to the source. And those steps of the tunnel and the life review and the light and the welcoming and all of that kind of stuff, those are steps on that journey. And that's why I think some, near-death experiences are all different, because we carry with us our own experience. I mean, we have an expectation of seeing something. And I think if we were to leave here and immediately be transferred to a totally different landscape, I think we wouldn't be able to handle it. As you know, we're still more individual than unity when we die. So I think we have to carry with us an expectation, a comforting expectation, which is a blessing, not a curse. And I think when Christians see heaven, or when Jews see the city, when Hindus see the gods, and all this kind of thing, Buddhists see, and all that kind of stuff. There are some universal principles. The light is a universal thing that everybody seems to see. The idea of love and acceptance, not only love and acceptance, but perfect love, perfect acceptance. I think those are universal constants that we are heading toward. But before we get there, we experience the typical steps of a near-death experience. I think that's what those steps are. So, yeah, I've never seen anybody who died and came back and wanted to come back. They all wanted to stay. They knew they had to come back, but they all wanted to stay. And if anybody listening to this conversation takes one thing away from it, I hope this: you don't have to fear death. Matter of fact, that's one of the reasons I wrote the near-death experience in the first place.
Well, it sounds like, and I'm going to make this a two-part question, but it
Okay.
sounds like you you are kind of a believer in um, Bruce Grayson's interpretation of the data, that the filter theory,
Yeah.
that some things we just turn off because
Yeah.
we have to
Hmm.
have an income, we have to provide food for our family and do all these things.
Yeah.
And so, focusing on God or spirituality is pretty low down
Hmm.
on the filter list a lot of times.
Hmm.
Um, you talked about your friend Joe Thompson.
Hmm.
I believe you haven't already mentioned that
Hmm.
early on in this conversation. Can you talk about that experience and why it's so prominent, and why you discuss it in the book?
Yeah. Uh, Joe Joe's experience gave me a personal handle. Nobody else had published his particular near-death experience, and I knew Joe very well, and so we could talk about it a lot. And that's the reason I chose his particular experience. I didn't want it was personal. Uh, Joe worked in a hospital. He's a man's man, a great guy. He likes to hunt and fish and laugh, and he loves his family, and he loves his community, and he loves his church, and he was very active singing in the praise group in our church and everything else, and singing in our choir, and he's just he's just a great guy. The last guy you would expect to have this kind of a spiritual experience, because he was just so normal. And yeah, he worked in a hospital, and he worked in the OR. As a matter of fact, he had a very technical job. I I asked him once, what is it you do, Joe? And Joe said to me, well, in his own inimitable way, he said, well, you know how they're putting in a lot of plastic shoulders and plastic knees and plastic hips and all this kind of stuff. And I said, yeah. He said, well, my job is to make sure they don't have any parts left over afterwards. And that was his way of explaining it. But he was on his way to the OR to work one morning, and he had a heart attack right in the hallway of the hospital. If you're going to have a heart attack, man, being in a fully equipped hospital on your way to the OR with people around you who you know, doctors and technicians, nurses who you know, that's a good way to have it. And
Yeah,
so,
big difference.
yeah, they got Joe to the OR within minutes, and the test revealed that he had to have a triple bypass right away. So they did. And the operation went just fine. He had no trouble with it. But when it came time for them to bring him back, his good friend, who was an anesthesiologist, couldn't get Joe back. Joe couldn't breathe, and nobody knew why. And they were looking, and pretty soon Joe flatlined. And his friend, thank goodness, he said, "I'm not going to let him go like this." And he reached in literally and pulled out the air tube, because he had the feeling that the air tube was obstructed somehow, and he had nothing to go on except that was his feeling, and he was going to lose Joe. And he says, "I'm not going to lose him without trying." And he pulled it out, and Joe breathed his first breath in I don't know how long.
Wow.
Well, I visited Joe in the hospital, and yeah, I could tell that he was kind of hesitant to talk about his whole thing, and I thought, well, maybe that's just normal. But a couple of days after he got out of the hospital, I went to see him at his house, and his mother-in-law was there with him. And the three of us sat around his kitchen table. And I said, Joe, there's something you're not telling me. What is this? Well, Joe is a child of his age, and he said, Jim, I'm going to tell you this, and I don't care whether you believe it or not. I'm going to tell you this. You're my minister. You ought to hear what happened. And I said, okay, sure. And he told me his story. And it was a wonderful story. And it had every single of the main incidents. And he felt himself floating out and seeing his body. He saw what he described as this beautiful bridge, the city, and well, a light. And he didn't describe necessarily a tunnel, but he described moving forward, not walking and not flying. He couldn't find words for it, just moving somehow toward it. And he saw his father. And he was given the opportunity. Do you want to go back or do you want to stay? And Joe really didn't want to come back. He wanted to stay, except he was to this day, he still is a great family man. His family means everything to him, his kids and his wife. And he knew he had to come back. And he began to wonder if one of the reasons he had to come back was to tell this story. And so he did tell me this story. And he was very relieved when I bought it all the way. I trusted Joe. I really did. It wasn't something that he imagined. This was real. I could see this is a life-changing thing for him. You could just see it in his eyes and feel it in the vibes. And so when I called him up after I retired, probably maybe 15 years, 14 years after I retired, I hadn't seen him during all that time. We had been in touch, email and all that kind of stuff, and through mutual friends. But when I called him up and I said, Joe, I'm writing this book and I'd like to close with your story. And it was dead silence on the other end of the line. And he said, I wonder if that's why I had to come back, so that you could tell this story to other people in a way that I couldn't. So I said, I want you to write it down just as clean as you already have a couple of times. So he sent me a copy of it. And Joe is not a writer, so all I did was clean up, punctuation and paragraphs and sentence structure like that. Otherwise, it's his words. And both of us come to the conclusion that maybe this is one of the reasons he had to come back, was to tell this story. And you say, well, why does this story need to be told? And that brings me to your first question. And probably I can best talk about it this way. I had a good friend who was older than me, a member of my church, a really successful life. He was in his 80s, very successful life. If you looked up success in the dictionary, there'd be Bradley's picture staring back at you, that kind of thing. He was not only a pillar of the community and a pillar of the church, but he had 2 doctorates in 2 different fields. He had founded a university. I mean, that's still in existence. How many people do that? And he just was always there when you needed him. Greatest guy in the world. And he was in the hospital, and I knew he was very sick, but I got a call one morning about 3:00 in the morning. And the nurse said, Reverend Willis, Bradley is here and he's not expected to live the night. And he's asking for you. Is there any chance you could come down? And I said, of course. So I put on my clothes, got in the car and drove to the hospital. I walked in and there's Bradley looking so vulnerable. He had tubes in his nose and tubes in his mouth and tubes in his wrist and electric this and lights going off. And it was a just typical American death, surrounded by all of this technology and beeping lights and everything else. And I could get into that too. But anyway, Bradley and I were good friends. I didn't have to kid around with him. So I said, Brad, are you ready to go? And he started to cry. Never seen Brad cry before. And I said, what is it? And he said, Jim, I can't kid you. He said, I've had a successful life. I know that. I'm not bragging when I say I'm very proud of the things that I've done. But I never did the one thing that was most important. And I said, what's that? He said, I never prepared for this moment. Well, he wasn't ready to die. He didn't die that night. Matter of fact, he lasted 10 more days. And I spent a good portion of every one of those days with him. And we talked about philosophy, we talked about religion, we talked about spirituality, we talked about heaven, we talked about all the rest of this stuff. I wasn't quite fully as developed then as I was now, but I was certainly on that path. I don't know if I helped him in those last 10 days, but I know he helped me for sure. And the idea of him saying, I never prepared for this moment, made me someday want to write a book that would help people prepare for when they reach the end of their life. They could leave this life in a good way. They could die a good death. They could come to understand that death is a part of living, and that it's not an enemy to be feared, but it's to be welcomed. Every single one of us is going to die, period. That's it. There's no way out. And so, why do we fear it so? And why is the American way of death so foreign to any kind of a relaxing, sustaining, self fulfilling way to step over into what is perfectly natural? And I thought, if I could write a book that would take away some of the sting, take away some of the fear of death, and help people to prepare for that moment so they wouldn't be like Bradley. If I could make people do, and I realized what a big job it was going to be, because American way of death is pretty foreign. You know, we don't die at home anymore, surrounded by loved ones and everything else. And yeah, we're able to do some good things. I mean, sometimes when pain is associated with death, it's nice to have some drugs that'll get rid of that pain. But um, in that sense, it's good. But in a lot of ways, um, I when kids can sometimes grow to be fully adults before they see their first dead body, um, that's not normal. That's not right. It's taking death and making it into something to be feared, an enemy. And I wanted to get rid of that. I wanted to make it a friend. Um, Not that we seek death, but when death seeks us, we are ready and prepared, and we can go willingly. So that's what I wanted to also do in this book.
So, what about Joe's story in particular
Mm-hmm.
made you say, this has to be the conclusion to my book? I need to have this in the book.
Yeah, I wanted a real solid, practical ending that would sum up everything I had said in the book. And everything about Joe's story seemed to sum up everything. Um, he had all of the stages right there, all of the stages of death and dying. He was in the prime of life, so that uh, people could understand that this doesn't just happen to old people who are sick. It can happen to any one of us. And it had the idea that here's a tough hunter, fisherman, sportsman, all this kind of stuff, who could just, without any warning, without any signs, all of a sudden collapse in the hospital with a heart attack. And it just had all of that stuff. And it was a way to take everything that I had said in the book so far and to tie it together. And to this day, when Joe and I are still in contact, when we write back to each other, he is still he's going strong, and he told his story in public for the first time after I had left, after I had retired and moved out here. He stood up in the church one Sunday, and he told his story aloud in public. And although I wasn't at that service, I'm told by those who were there, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Here I am, the the talented talker who's been preaching for 50 years, that kind of thing. And here's Joe, who's never spoken public hardly in his life, and he stands up and tells his story, can move a whole congregation to tears. That's pretty powerful.
Do you think this, before I have a couple questions about your philosophies, but before we get there, I wanted to ask you if you think this is important culturally. I
Mm-hmm.
kind of cover this with everybody we talk to because it
Yeah.
seems like we've embraced materialism for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of folks who've grown up in my generation, I'm sure in your generation as well, that have had this philosophy that's kind of bled into culture where they believe a lot of the things they do just don't matter.
Hmm.
There's no significance really
Hmm.
to life. It's a nihilistic type of perspective. And it seems like the more that we embrace these concepts that everybody's going to have an experience like this at some point, it can change the culture. Do you feel like you see that kind of coming, or do you think we're a little ways off from that?
Um, I see it coming. I think we're a little ways off, and I'm not entirely confident that we're going to get there. But I am confident that if we don't, we're in serious trouble. We're playing with toys. This whole materialistic lifestyle that we lead, the whole technological lifestyle, we're playing with toys that we are not mature enough spiritually, mentally, morally, ethically to handle. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. And I think materialism is a kind of a dead end street. In one way, it's a wonderful thing. The scientific method is a powerful tool, and it can crack open any nut, and all this kind of thing. And the scientific method is a wonderful tool, but it's a tool that is designed to be used in a certain way. You can't use a saw to hammer in a nail. Well, you can, but you'll destroy the nail and the saw both, that kind of thing. Um, and when we use the scientific method, or when we use our intellectual capacities or our intelligence to try to figure these things out all the time and to find a rational scientific explanation for everything, that's perfectly fine. But I think we have to understand it's only one tool in the box. There are other tools that are even more important. And I don't think we will ever be able to use a materialistic science to understand the reality of with a capital R that's bigger than the reality with a small r that we all experience. We are enmeshed in this fivefold fence of touch, taste, sense, smell, hearing, and that's good because it helps us relate to the world around us. But as we're discovering now through the new physics, it is not adequate. We have to be able to find a way to peer over that fence. I am very encouraged by what we're seeing now in the James Webb Space Telescope. Not by just the images we're seeing, but by the fact that those very images are making science say, oh my gosh, we were wrong. When was the last time you heard scientists say we were wrong? Not very often. And then
Not much.
afterwards, and they'll sit there and they'll say, "Well, that's what science is." Of course. Well, yeah, but it takes a pretty big obvious thing to make get that to happen. Uh, Science, the whole field of science, is littered with people who had new ideas and were absolutely crucified because those new ideas were not accepted. And it's true in archaeology, it's true in science, it's true in mathematics, it's true in everything, religion, everything else. I mean, look at Galileo and all that kind of stuff. Um, it takes a lot to convince people that materialistic science might not be able to do it. And yet that's exactly what's going on now. Thank goodness for the James Webb Telescope. But that gives me hope because there's a metaphor here. The James Webb Telescope is extremely the product of intelligence and science. It's extremely the product of technology, just as is the Hadron Collider, over in Europe. Uh, great scientific minds, technology all the way. And yet, what does that technology do? It takes us into realms where technology cannot go. And if we're willing to follow, that is encouraging to me because I think that the same thing may happen in terms of near death experiences. Raymond Moody was a doctor. Uh, Bruce Grayson was a doctor. Eben Alexander was a doctor. They were medical people, steeped in their profession, respected in their profession, and yet they were able to move beyond it. So that gives me hope. It really does. It hopes that maybe technology doesn't have to be destructive. Maybe technology can uh, lead us to these new frontiers. At least I hope so, because I'm afraid if they don't, we could be in a very dangerous position, and we could, uh, when you come right down to it, dare I say, destroy ourselves. It is entirely possible.
Yeah, and I've met Bruce Grayson, and
Yeah.
I he is so sincere
Oh
in
yeah. Yeah.
the scientific research that he does. He doesn't have ulterior motives,
Mm-mm.
and
It just
I think people miss that, you know.
that shines through his writing. It certainly does. Yeah.
Um, okay, let me ask you this. This is a personal question before we
Okay.
go back to the book. Do you feel like you moved out right into the woods to meditate, to wrestle with God? Do you feel like you've gotten the answer that you were seeking, or do you think you're just in the process?
No, both. I've gotten the answer. There's no doubt about that. I was talking to um, what's his name, George Norrie on Coast to Coast a couple of weeks ago, and he wound up the interview by saying, "Jim," he says, "do you have any doubt in your mind that there is a life after this one?" And I think he was expecting some kind of a great, speech or something, and I just said, "No." He said, "Did you used to?" And I said, "Yeah." And between the yeah and the no was my life. I don't have any doubts now whatsoever, not even the slightest smidgen, that there is a life beyond this one, and we enter it when we die. Um, on the other hand, I would like to say that that has changed me entirely. No, it hasn't. It has changed me a lot. But putting this stuff into practical applications. Um, I'm human like everybody else. I'm no guru sitting on a mountaintop or anything like that. I have moments of loneliness. I have moments of despair. I get out here away from everybody, and I don't see what's going on in the world. Then I get in the car and I drive into town for groceries, and everybody seems to be moving so fast and talking so loud, and it's noisy and it's confusing. And I come out here, even when the cicadas are going crazy, making a lot of noise out here as they are right now. You come out here and you're a part of nature. You're That's where you came from, uh, and you're the spiritual tip of the spear, so to speak, of nature. There are other animals that are much more adapted and can live much better than me. Um, Out here in nature, and they do. I don't know. I mean, I feed the deer every day, and I sit in the porch, and they come right up to the porch and stare at me. And if I haven't put out corn, they sit there and stomp their foot until I do. That kind of thing. They're much more apt to be able to survive in nature than me. On the other hand, I think I have something that they don't. I think I have a sense of spirituality and the next life that they don't, and I think that probably is one of the things that separates us. And so, yeah, I think my prayer has been answered, and I don't have any doubt about that. I came out here to spend 1 year, and I've spent 16 so far, so that gives you an idea. I'm never going to leave. You have to pull me kicking and screaming away from here. But on the other hand, putting it all in practice, boy, that may take a lifetime. I hope I have enough time to really be the person that I know I can be, and I know that I am, because we all fall short.
Okay, so based on all of the experience that you've had, what do you expect happens when you die?
Wow. I think everybody's experience is going to be different. And I've had enough of experience of out of body experiences that when I come back and try to describe them, I realize that language is not sufficient. Our language was invented to describe things on this side of the fivefold perception fence, not the other side. And it's kind of like waking up from a dream. when the dream was so vivid and you understood it and you were there. You weren't just watching it, you were there and were part of it, and you came to understand something in that dream. And then you come back and you try to tell people what the dream was, and it sounds silly because language just falls short. I don't think we can ever say this is what it is. I think all we can say is this is what it is like. So when you say to me, what happens when you die? I have a suspicion that for me, it's probably going to be different for you because I've had different experiences than you, and the conditions of death. I hope that when the time comes, I am fully awake, fully alert. Maybe I'll suffer a massive heart attack or something like that. And I hope that in that moment, the consciousness that is permeating this body will say, okay, it's over. And that consciousness will depart. And I will see my body, and I will turn from there and turn from this material world. And I think I will go through what I would only perceive as a tunnel. Um, and I think it's probably a tunnel because that's the only way our minds can describe getting from one reality to another. We're conscious of wormholes or black holes or something like that. And we describe those in terms of tunnels. I suppose that's probably in our minds, and there will be that tunnel. But at the end of that tunnel, there will be a light. And there at the end of that light, I think I will be welcomed. Whether it is by a loved one or whether by a spiritual presence or my own spiritual guide is what I firmly suspect, the spiritual guide that I discovered 15 years ago. I suspect that is me on the other side. I suspect that spirit guide that I am now in contact with daily. I suspect that's the me that I left on the other side when I came over here into the material fence, when I came through the Higgs field, and my energy took on matter. And for so far 78 years, I have lived in this body. And when the time comes, I will leave this body and just as I want. And then there will come that life review. And I don't think the life review is to judge whether I'm going to go to heaven or hell or anything like that. I don't think that's the purpose of a life review. I think what that life review is a chance for us to fulfill what we came here for. We came here to gather experience, individual experience. We couldn't get that in the source. In the source, it's perfect peace, perfect unity, perfect wholeness, perfect oneness. But what can't you experience in the source? You can't experience individuality. How can you when you're total unity with everything? And so I think we came over here to help the source grow. And how do we do that? By entering into this particular dimension of material reality, and gathering experience. And not only good experience, but experience comes good and bad. That's the trouble. Experience is a two-headed coin. And in a way that gives me a great hope now, because when things are going bad and I'm feeling alone or I'm feeling misunderstood or relationship problems or when I'm feeling sick or something like that, I don't have to despair and say what's wrong. Nothing is wrong. That's one of the things that I came here to experience. The other side of the coin, so to speak. And so in that life review, we deposit, I think, all of our life experiences. Some people call it the book of life. Some people call it the Akashic record or Akashic library. I think we kind of check in and say, okay, here's all my experiences. Boom. And we deposit them so that the source can grow. And then we move from there eventually into that other point of greater reality. And have there been bad out of body experiences or bad near death experiences? Yeah, very, very few. The vast majority, I think, are very positive, of people who don't really want to come back because they use that sense of perfect peace, perfect compassion, perfect acceptance. They always put the word perfect in front of it. Boy, that's kind of exciting to me. And so without being morbid at all, I can say when you say to me, what happens when you die? I could, to put it in a nutshell, I could just say, well, I'm going home.
That's a great way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you this. There's a couple more questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think I know what you're going to say, but when someone picks up near death experiences, Afterlife Journeys and Revelations, they read the book, what are you hoping that they'll feel or their gain from reading your book?
I hope it'll give them a feeling of, um, I hope it'll release the feeling of fear and replace it with a feeling of not only acceptance, but anticipatory acceptance. And I say that without trying to rush death at all, without trying to bring it about. But the idea of anticipating this is an adventure. As humans, whenever we leave a stage of life, it's a death. We experience it as a death. When we leave and go off to college or leave home and go to a job or something like that, what we are doing is saying goodbye to childhood. Now, the ancients used to help people along. They used to have rituals, vision quests, and change the name and things like that. We don't do that. All we do is give you a driver's license and say, now you're on your own. But Elizabeth Kubler-Ross pointed out that every stage of life is a death, and we don't know what's coming. That's why when I first went to college, for instance, my parents brought me up to my dormitory, and I walked inside the room, and they helped me unload my stuff, and they turned around and left, got in the car and drive away. And I just could say, wow, all of a sudden I realized life's never going to be the same again. It's a different thing. And we tend to fear those things. We really do because they're different. We don't know what's coming. And we're much more creatures of comfort and habit and that kind of thing. And the more we know, the easier it is. When I did my cross country trip on my bicycle, my family dropped me off in California, and I took the bike down to the ocean and dipped the back tire in the Pacific Ocean, and they took off and they said, "See you in 6 weeks," and off they went. And I'm sitting here with a very frail looking bicycle, heading until I put my front tire in the Atlantic Ocean, and I didn't know what was going to happen. It was going to be an adventure, and was I afraid? Yeah, but I had prepared as much as possible. I had looked at maps, and I had looked at the territory, and I tried to scout out what was ahead, and I had done a lot of practice runs and all that kind of thing, so that it wasn't a fearful thing that just left you, scared to death to die, to take off rather. And I think that's what death has to be. Let's look into it. Let's check it out. Let's learn as much as we can, and understand that part of that's going to be fear because we don't know for sure exactly how it's going to happen. We'll find out, and when it's all over, I think probably our first words will be, "Ah, I knew it." I don't know.
Do you think this will be the last book you write on this topic, or do you see yourself doing a little more work here?
I figured this was going to be the end, but the judging from the amount of feedback I've had on it so far, and the number of interest out there, and really good questions people have asked, there may be another one. I just don't know yet. Who knows? Who can say? I've got two more that I've got. I've got another one coming out in October with Visible Ink, and that's on a totally different topic. It's called Lost Loot, and it's about everything from lost pirate treasure to cursed treasure to everything from Captain Kidd's treasure to what's going on in Skinwalker Ranch and all that kind of stuff. Well, the one I'm writing right now is on another totally different topic. That's on Bigfoot sightings in the world. And then I've got one more under contract that has to be in by next December about mystic areas around the world. Everything from the Bermuda Triangle to the Alaska Triangle to all these different places. That's all going to take from now until December. I'm under contract and deadline. But when next January rolls around and I start to think, what's next? Who can say?
You're a busy man.
Well, No, if you're doing what you really want to do, it's not work. And it's not even really busy if you can just do it whenever you want. And I'll tell you, this retirement is a wonderful thing. If I had realized what a great gig it was, I would have retired years ago.
I don't know if everybody takes as much full advantage of it as you have, but
Well, thank you.
uh,
I appreciate that.
where so for our listeners and our viewers, where can they learn more about your work, learn more about you?
Easiest way is just go to my website, www.jimwillis.net. And there on the website, all the books are listed and all the reviews, both good and bad, and everything else. I do is click on it, and it'll take you to a place where you can get it if you're interested. There on the website, it also shows not only my Facebook page, but it shows my YouTube page. And my daughter Jen and I have produced a lot of videos that go into a lot more depth about some of the stuff that we've talked about. Also, there's something I just have to emphasize on this website page. There's a contact page. You and I can talk to each other, and that's great. We can see each other. We have no idea who's listening. So if anybody goes to the website and discovers my contact page, you can send me an email. And so far, I've been able to answer, I think, just about every single email that I get. So um, I just love to be able to talk to this greater community, which brings me to the work that you do and people like you. It's important work that you're doing, Justin, and bringing together a worldwide community of people who can share similar ideas and get from me. It's the best use of technology. I know technology has a lot of bad things about it, but what you're doing and is using technology for a noble, wonderful purpose. So keep up the good work, man.
Um, I really appreciate that, Jim, and thank you so much for what you're doing.
Well, thank
Um,
you. Thank you. It's
I think it shouldn't go unnoticed that all the years you spent in ministry prior to what you're doing now is all servant work in my opinion. But
well, I wouldn't have wanted to have missed it. I really wouldn't have. It was very satisfying.
well, we really appreciate you, and yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you down the road.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Justin. Appreciate it.